Hello and welcome to a Diminishing Returns video special. This is tying into our recent The Mummy episode, in which I spoke about my love for this scene from the 1944 film The Mummy's Curse, the final quote-unquote real film in Universal's Mummy series. After this it lay dormant until a crossover with Abbott and Costello about 10 plus years on. Before we got to our usual thing of pitching sequels to The Mummy and all that sort of stuff, I spoke about how much I loved this scene, and so I wanted to share it with you, but it isn't readily available online anywhere, hence me bringing you this, a review of this specific scene. If you like the look of this, even though I'm talking all over it, then hopefully it'll convince you to go out and dig the film up, no pun intended, so that you can enjoy it in context. It's not an amazing film by any stretch of the imagination, but it has a certain charm to it. Personally, I think it's one of the highlights of Universal's attempts to bring The Mummy to screen, but it is a film that's very obscure and difficult to come by, so happy hunting! To give you some context, this was the fourth film in Universal's somewhat rebooted classic Mummy series, the fifth film in their Mummy series overall, but the fourth to follow Lon Chaney Jr.'s Mummy, Carice, as opposed to Boris Karloff's Mummy, Imhotep. Now, the previous film, The Mummy's Ghost, sees the titular mummy, Carice, essentially hypnotising a woman who's part of the old trope that we discussed in our episode of a woman who looks exactly like the villain's old lover. She's called Amina, and one of the film's twists and turns is that it turns out that she is indeed actually the reincarnation of the mummy's old lover, Ananka. That film ends with a classic angry mob pursuing the mummies into the nearby swamps. It's actually quite a tragic scene in that very classic Universal monster way. Ananka's been dosed with some magic potion that essentially causes her to rapidly age and deteriorate, so Carice carries her in his arms and they sink down into the bog, united in death. So here we go with the clip. As you can see, there's a bunch of workers. They're draining the swamp as part of a land development, and all the locals are very superstitious and unhappy because they believe the area to be haunted by the mummy. And oh, look at that, they've unearthed Ananka, and she begins to rise from the ground. This is actually a male hand, the first hand that you see. I'm not entirely sure why. The subsequent hands are female. Now, the previous film was set in Massachusetts, so it's just a classic bit of bad film continuity that this one moves the action to Louisiana with absolutely no explanation given. At this point in the film, there's all sorts of action going on with Carice the mummy murdering people, magic grave robbers, all sorts of stuff going on, and Anka's been left to just rot in the ground on her own. So it really adds to the tragedy of this woman being led to die in a swamp. It's very sad in its own way, and I think it really does have a quite emotional undertone, this scene, for what is essentially a zombie rising from the earth. You'll notice the very otherworldly feeling this scene achieves. It all just feels slightly off. That's because back then, as many of you probably know, they used hand crank cameras, and that meant one of the tricks you could pull out was to either overcrank or undercrank the thing in order to increase or decrease the frame rate, creating a slow or fast motion effect. The difference in frame rate achieved by the slight undercranking here gives an ever so slightly sped up bit of footage and just makes it very eerie, dreamlike, and personally I just think it really adds to this scene and makes it just all the more wonderful. It's a shame that the modern equivalent of these techniques just don't have the same effect. They tend to look rather hideous. A little bit of trivia for you, this film was originally called The Mummy's Return, very similar to the Brendan Fraser vehicle. Now I think part of why this scene works so well is the performance of Ananka here. The woman playing Ananka, the mummy, is Virginia Christine, who is taking over the role from the previous film. But I think she has a really tragic sense about her movements here, the way she kind of rises and falls and just isn't quite right, but slowly gets stronger and more youthful as she walks along. This scene is so iconic in a very underhand way. It's been emulated countless times. It's a classic idea, the dead rising from the ground, but it's the first instance I've really seen it played out, and it's one of the best instances of it being played out on film that I've ever seen. You'll see all sorts of modern films drawing upon this, whether consciously or subconsciously, just tapping into it through cultural subconscious. Spider-Man 3, for example, may not be the favourite film of you guys out there, but obviously it's a good example of a big blockbuster. The scene where Sandman creates himself, builds himself up, is very reminiscent of what you see here, and I do imagine Sam Raimi was taking some inspiration, as I say, subconsciously or not, from this film. Fun fact for you, The Mummy's Hand, the first in the Lon Chaney Mummy films, was released in 1940 and set in 1940, but the sequel, The Mummy's Tomb, is inexplicably set 30 years on, despite not updating the costumes or anything, and despite them repeatedly referring to the ongoing war. The Mummy's Ghost is then set about 2 years after that, and then this film, The Mummy's Curse, is set 25 years after that, which means that this film really should be set in 1997. Once again, they make absolutely no effort to modernise anything seen in the film whatsoever, so you can just assume that civilization peaked in 1944 and it's been plateauing ever since. As I say, I absolutely love that sequence. I think it's really quite beautiful, tragic, haunting, eerie. The emotional undercurrent is far greater than anything you'd expect from these sorts of films. Everything about it works so well, and I just think as a film fan, this is something you should really see. The rest of the film, yeah, it's not great, but it's one of those films where there's just enough in it to sell it to people who love cinema. Anyway, I hope that was informative and you enjoyed that. If so, please do go and check out our podcast, Diminishing Returns. Check out our website, dimreturns.com. It's sort of a central hub for everything we do. If you've never listened, it's a podcast where we discuss a film, have a laugh, and then we pitch our own ideas for the sequel, what we feel the sequel ought to be. It features myself and 2 others. All of us work in the film, TV industry in some capacity, so, we vaguely know what we're talking about. Go and check it out. There'll be links to the iTunes page and SoundCloud and all these other places you can check it out in the description as well, so do enjoy. Bye!